of speakers we've had. Very topical. There's some stuff you'll hear and see tonight. I hope it's the first time anybody's heard it outside the practitioner community. So firstly, I'd like to welcome Peter Billing, who's the General Manager at Evo Energy, and Derrin Limbrick, who we met previously when we were talking about power line maintenance. He's the Strategic Account Manager there. They're going to give us an overview on how the ACT household sector kept the lights on. I think there was a lot of overcool on the top, there was a lot of scrambling below the surface during the recent energy shortfalls. So I'd like Derrin up first, and Derrin's going to do our welcome acknowledgement country tonight.
Hello. There we go, it's working. We might just move to the next slide if that's okay. So firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for having us this evening. Thanks again for Bill for inviting me to come along. And also welcome to the people that are joining us online this evening. So as Bill said, he's asked that we can do the, I think it's one back actually, Bill. If we can do the acknowledgement to country tonight, and we're very pleased to be able to do that actually. So we'll move straight into that. So we are honoured to be meeting on the ancestral lands of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We acknowledge these first Australians as the traditional custodians of this land, whose cultures are among the oldest living in human history. We pay respect to the elders of the communities in the Murrumbidgee region and extend our recognition to their descendants past, present and future. Now is it back over to us? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so as I said to you earlier, thank you for having us this evening. Bill, you sort of introduced us earlier, but I'll do another quick one if that's okay. So my name's Derrin Limbrick, I'm our Strategic Account Manager for Evo Energy. I'm here tonight with our General Manager at Evo Energy, Peter Billing. So some of you might remember me from when I was here a couple of months ago to talk to you, and I do remember some of the faces in the room, but there's also some new faces as well, so it's really pleasing to see that. So we're going to talk to you tonight about some things we think are very topical. Firstly, I'm going to cover off a little bit about who Evo Energy is and where we sit within the energy supply chain. And then Peter's going to talk to us a little bit more about what's happening in the energy markets, and also we're going to follow that up with some discussion around energy or electricity pricing. So hopefully by the end you'll have a much clearer idea of Evo Energy and our role, the role that we play here in the ACT. You'll be able to decipher some of the stuff that's been happening out there in the energy markets in the last couple of months, and you'll also have a clearer idea on how electricity pricing works. So, who is Evo Energy? Something I always like to do in these sorts of presentations is just get a quick round of hands for everyone in the room who's heard of Evo Energy before. That's very good actually. So it's most people in the room, so that's really pleasing. I guess why I like to start with that is because there is often a bit of confusion out there as to who Evo Energy is, especially when people think about Evo Energy and their retailer, and there can be a little bit of confusion. So I'll tell you a little bit about that now. So Evo Energy are essentially what we call the distributed network services provider for the ACT. So what does that actually mean? So I guess our core responsibility as a DNSP is to manage the electricity and gas network here in the ACT, but also to make sure that we're providing reliable and efficient supply of electricity and gas to the residents of the ACT as well. So what are the energy or electricity and gas networks? So I've got this diagram up because I think this does help explain this to you probably much better than me just trying to explain it in person. So you often hear the electricity network talked about as poles and wires, but I think this sort of demonstrates it's a little bit more complex than that. So I guess the first part of the network kicks off with what we call the transmission network or transmission lines, and that's a really large power poles you might see around, probably around the outskirts of the ACT and running into some parts of the ACT as well. And their job is to transport the electricity into the ACT, so from other parts of the country into the ACT. We then have what we call our zone substations, so they're those really large pieces of electrical infrastructure that you'll see around strategic locations around the ACT, and they receive that electricity and then they convert it into a form that we can then look to distribute to other parts of the energy network, so power transformers and then what we call distribution substations. So they're all of those bluey coloured boxes that you'll see all throughout your neighbourhood of different sizes. And then from there, the electricity is then converted into and distributed into what we call the low voltage network. And that's essentially the poles and wires, especially here in Western Creek, that you'll see running through your backyards. And in some suburbs, we have that network running underground as well. And then for the gas network, we have 6 major regulating stations around the ACT where that gas is received from outside or from different parts of Australia, I should say. And then a really extensive pipeline underground network underground gas pipeline that we use to transport that gas, again, through to all the different homes and businesses within the ACT. So, any questions before I move on? Fantastic. Must be doing an okay job. Bill, can we move on to the next slide? Fantastic. Okay, so now I just want to really quickly touch on the electricity supply chain. I think this will then sort of segue really well into some of the stuff that Peter's going to talk about. So I guess the first part of the supply chain is generation. You've probably been hearing a fair bit about this in the media recently. So there's a whole range of different generators that exist across Australia, from gas, coal, wind, solar, water, geothermal, even biomass. And I guess their primary role is to generate the electricity and then push it into what we call the NEM, or the National Electricity Market. There are really big power transformers that exist on those sites that convert the low voltage electricity into high voltage, at which point it then links in with the transmission network, which we just spoke about, which essentially is there to transport that generated electricity through to different parts of Australia. The next stage is what we call the distribution network, and that's primarily where Evo Energy come into this picture. And as I mentioned before, Evo Energy are the distributed network services provider for the ACT. And it's our role then to make sure we manage those networks that allow the transportation of that electricity through to the residents and customers within the ACT. And then the last part of that process is the retailer. So the retailer then purchases the electricity on your behalf and then charges that onto you via your electricity bill that you receive. Okay, and that's quite often where there is that confusion between people understanding the role Evo Energy plays versus the role the retailer plays. And that's something we'll unpack a little bit further into some of the stuff that Peter's going to talk about soon. So, before I go on, are there any questions? No? Wonderful. Excellent. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. Thanks, Bill. And then we're going to talk about what is going on in the energy market. I'm going to hand over to Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Derrin. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight to talk to you about this. We're not experts on the electricity market, but we certainly play a role in the market, and so if there's really detailed questions around how the national electricity market operates, then I probably won't be able to answer those, but I can certainly give you that overview level so you can see how it all kind of fits together. So go just the next slide. Thought I'd just start with showing the reach of the national electricity market. So it's an eastern states market. It doesn't include Western Australia. Western Australia is its own market, and then the Northern Territory is also a separate market. In fact, it doesn't formally operate as a market. It has all the components of the market, but they don't actually transfer cash between the generators from a market perspective, they certainly get paid for what they generate, but it's not through a market. But you can see the reach of the market. Obviously, there are parts of Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia that the grid that's operated by people such as ourselves don't actually reach and actually aren't on the grid. So if anybody's ever been to Mount Isa, for example, Mount Isa is not actually connected to the national grid. And if you've been following the press over recent years, there's a thing called crop of string where the Mount Isa is desperately looking to get that connection made. But there are places like that that have distribution lines and are connected to an electricity network, but they're standalone and they're not part of the actual network. So that blue area is all the reach of where the national market goes and the associated distribution networks that are connected to that grid. Yeah, thanks. Yep. So let's, the next one. Yeah, that's it. So just to give you a sense of what happened the last couple of weeks and going back, where there was a lot of talk in the press around shortfall of energy, and that there could be load shedding. In fact, the ACT government and ourselves put out on the Wednesday, I can't think of the date now, 15th sounds about right, yeah, that for people to consider conserving electricity at that stage, but there was nothing directly imposed to say this will actually be taken off at that point in time. So if we start on the left-hand side, what really happened at that stage was a couple of key things. Is one, the demand increased, and increased relative to that time of year. And so there was quite high demand at that particular time. But there was also a lack of generation resource. And that was through a number of things, predominantly through both forced or unplanned and planned outages of major generation demand. So basically, we had an imbalance between supply and demand. The supply side was limited and the demand side was increasing. What that resulted in is the first thing that happens, and it's being a market, supply and demand are the key components to that. So supply goes up, demand goes down, cost goes up. And so that's a natural operation of the market. The AEMO, so the Australian Energy Market Operator, who are the group who administer the market, they then put a hold on wholesale prices. So you would have heard that, where they said they capped wholesale prices at $300 a megawatt hour. And so that was really to protect customers, so that we as residential customers and even relatively large customers don't purchase directly from the market. That's done through a retailer, so we buy our electricity at a retail bill. Those retailers operate in the wholesale market, so they're buying against those prices, so they're exposed to those increased prices. Now, what most retailers do, and pretty well all of them do, is they do buy long-term contracts, so they hedge the amount of electricity they buy, and then they top up off that short-term market. So the short-term market that has the volatility in it, when it's really low, they make more money. When it's really high, they make less money. So they are exposed to that, and that goes into the whole makeup of how they decide what they're going to charge us as a rate for their electricity. So we got to that point where that significant increase in demand, a lack of generation, or the amount of generation required, prices rose, they were capped. Then the second step is the next step that they did was they actually then suspended the market altogether. Because what happens is if, now I don't have anything to do with generation, so I'm not putting forward a tainted view around how, I'm just going to describe it as I understand it. So what happens is the smaller, quite expensive operation to operate generators, that actually their prices up around that $300 a megawatt hour as just normal cover their costs. They obviously pull back and say, well, I'm not going to put any energy into the market because I'm going to lose money. And some would argue that some that are making a lot of money also did the same thing, but I that's not for me to comment. But so what happened is, the next step that AEMO took was to say, well, we'll suspend the market and we will direct generators to supply energy, and then they will, at that they get automatically compensated. There's a mechanism within their rules that allows them to compensate them back. So the market, they're not being paid from the market. They ultimately are, it still comes back from the retailers, but they get compensated. So they basically took control of the market to try and ensure that there would be enough supply. Now, it's still very constrained. For approximately 2 weeks, AEMO held daily briefing sessions to all the operators, so people like ourselves, so we attended those daily briefings, where they described what was happening in the market and what was predicted for the next 24 hours. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And so what we then did as part of that, because we get to that point where there's less energy available, less electricity available, we then started talking to the major customers within the ACT and sort of basically put them on notice in a polite way, not as an impolite way. In fact, Derrin did most of that work. We actually rang them up, spoke to them about where we're at and said, if we get to that point, are you prepared to reduce your supply? Because they're big users. You take 2 or 3 of those off and you can create a lot more headroom. And that was basically being done in both the ACT, New South Wales, Victoria at times, and also Queensland. So all of the key providers that run the lines, like people like ourselves, were having those conversations with our customers. And basically that's what we were looking to do, is say if needed, if called on by AEMO to reduce supply quickly, then we can do that. The last step in the process, and this is the technical term for it, there's a thing called rotational load shedding. And what that means is that if we get directed to drop a certain amount of load, so our maximum demand is around 660 megawatt hours. That's around our maximum demand. So say we were operating at that at a particular time and they said, we need you to drop 60 of that load. So we would then look at our combination of feeders, and we basically can just turn the switch off immediately on a feeder. We might leave it on, say they say it's for the next 4 hours. So we would take, say, 6 feeders off for 4 hours, for an hour, and then we would put them back on and drop 6 more off, and then put them back on and then put take 6 more off. So you're sort of rotating the pain, I guess, of not having supply. That's the worst case scenario. There is one step if they lose control and they have a major outage, then they'll just drop, whole significant areas. But that's usually with that. If you get to that rotational load shedding, then you pretty much control that. In my time in the industry, which you can probably guess is a reasonable amount of time, the last time that I'm aware of rotational load shedding, and I was working in Queensland at the time was probably 10, 15 years ago, so it's not something that happens very often. Sorry. No, Callide, I'll actually sort of kind of show where that kind of sits in a moment. Indirectly, not directly, but yeah, Callide obviously had that major fire of one of their units, and then it also affected a second unit. That obviously just takes away that big chunk of generation in one hit and makes it unavailable for, that's over 12 months it's off, and I think the second unit that wasn't actually part of the fire has come back online, but that original unit that had the fire is still offline. So, and that pays into a bit of that bottom circle around the amount of generation available, because normally that would be part of the generation available. So that's sort of how it all operates, and that's how the role that we play in that process is coordinating that reduction in supply and in demand if required. So Bill, I can just go to the next slide. This slide is a cut down version of a real 1 week of supply. So if I start across the coloured lines that we've got there, forget about the dates aren't relevant, and I'm not going to suggest which state this is associated with, but it is very representative of exactly what happened. So the purple line on top, at least I call it purple, the purple line on top is the peaks and troughs of low day to day. So you can see you've got peaks around, if you can follow down that dotted line, it's around 6 o'clock at night, which is pretty much, there's still some commercial road happening, but people are home, they're turning on air conditioning, they're turning things on in their home, and that's generally pretty consistently across Australia when the peak demand is these days. You then have lows during the day, and one of those is usually associated with solar, rooftop solar playing a role. So you see that drop down during the day, and then there's different times when lows not as great. So this is electricity load across one state, across across 7 days, Monday through to Sunday. Now the purple dotted line that runs across and runs about between 4 and 5, that is, they also put on their graph the lowest minimum demand. So at some point in time, those troughs have actually got all the way down to that level. So it's quite a reduction, and that would almost certainly be on a weekend, most likely a Sunday, and probably on a very warm sunny day where there's a lot of rooftop solar, but there's not a lot of other load, so that minimum demand gets quite low. The green line that's moving around, that's recording generation that's online and spinning, but it's actually not taking load. So it's actually sitting there available to be used at any time, and what they're trying to do is make sure that that's always at a level that if you lose two major items of plant, like caloide, for example, like losing that machine, which is a large machine, if you lose two of them at one time, that's the buffer you've still got left. And as long as the purple line and the green line don't come together, AEMO's happy, the market's operating exactly the way it should be. Now, where we started to get to the other day is all the way down to the red line, which means that there's no backup. So basically, there's no reserve whatsoever. So if the load goes up more, or an item of generation drops out, the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining, if it's at that time of day, then there'll be less generation than there is actually demand. So that's the bit that they were trying to manage to. And then during that week around the 15th, for about 4 or 5 days, we were at that red line area where they were literally monitoring on a minute by minute basis, and that's when we were sort of on standby. Now, it's really the critical time generally will be that sort of 4 through to 6:30 to 8 o'clock in that sort of time period where you're in that maximum time. So it would have been highly unlikely for anything to happen during the day. It would have more likely been dinner time. We would have been, in worst case, we might have been standing in the dark at dinner time without our air conditioning going if it had happened at that stage. So I'll just go to the next. Yeah, so.
The surge that recently happened you're talking about, was it commercial or residential that was the biggest role? Because you could argue a lot of factors that last year we were in COVID, lockdown, everyone was home, whole Australia was locked down, yet we didn't have enough, we had no problem with power last year, but then all of a sudden this year, not Canberra alone, across the board. I understand that retailers pulled out because we didn't want to lose money and all that sort of thing, but it's like we didn't purchase it, we didn't look at our data and go, oh, we need X amount of megawatt to maintain, and working from home hasn't reduced. A lot of government agencies and all that are also working from home. It doesn't, it's not adding up, and you also had a big draw if it wasn't commercial or residential, because months and months ago, rooftop solar, which is probably 3 or 4% of the feeding across the grid now, or maybe a bit more.
There's about, there's over, was it 20-odd% in the ACT that could do, but then
we were all saying that it's now flooding the grid with excess power.
Yep.
Yet here we are saying now we haven't got enough power.
Yep.
It's not adding up in the sense that, and you know, how much of the solar farms now are actually going back into the grid, because if we were to put it back into the grid instead of getting a fit for it, is that, you know, how much of those farms that the government's invested in.
Yep.
And I'm assuming that you guys are fully owned by the government, is that correct?
No, we're half owned by government, half owned privately.
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions to be answered.
Yeah.
In the way that they structure it.
So during this period of time, so the level of demand, so people using energy that happened in that period of time was larger than normal for that particular time of year. But it wasn't beyond the normal bounds of what could have been really high demand. But it was high for that time of year. The critical piece is the amount of generation available, which isn't, and if you think about the time of day where those peaks were on the previous slide, it's when solar is actually not, rooftop solar, and in fact commercial solar is actually not producing anything at all, because it's once, solar probably at this time of year, it'd be sort of 3, 4 o'clock, it would start to become relatively ineffective, because there's just not enough, there's not enough sun power in effect. So it was really the generation issue that was the issue, that lack of reserve, having things like Callide, not one of those big units at Callide not available. I can't remember all the, there was a number, I think, what's the Victorian one? In Victoria there was units off there. So it was that real lack of generation, and then a particularly cold spell that just pushed the peak up a little bit more, that brought those two lines together. So it's really more on the generation side than it is on the demand side. Because that wouldn't have been the highest demand day, or it won't have been the highest demand day of winter, but it was relative to the available generation. Yeah.
Who did you ask, or can you say who you asked to back off use?
No, I probably prefer not to. There's about 10 organisations in the ACT that are on that list that we talk to. One I will mention, because they actually volunteered to do that, and that was Icon Water. So they've got a lot of large pumping load. They actually, they weren't asked to reduce, but they actually voluntarily did some. But the others I probably prefer not to.
Government and private?
Yeah, government and private, predominantly private, yeah. And the biggest energy users other than someone like Icon generally don't tend to be government users. Yeah.
Government users?
Sorry, they don't tend to be the government users. I mean, predominantly most government is their buildings and the load associated with the buildings, as opposed to a more commercial, right?
How is the load distributed between commercial and residential in the ACT?
Yeah, well, as you know, being a resident, ACT is really well planned compared to most cities, because there is a real concentration of commercial and then residential is separate. So from our major supply points, what we call zone substations out, and we push out what is called a feeder, so lines that go out and feed around that. They are pretty much dedicated residential and then dedicated commercial. Certainly not 100%.
But that's not what I meant.
Yeah, sorry.
What is, of all the electrons you guys shift, was it like 20% or 50% goes to commercial and 50% goes to residential?
Can I take that on notice? I'm happy to provide that back to you. Really, in the ACT, there isn't a large commercial load relative to other cities, where there's, as you know, there's not a lot of industry in the ACT, so you don't have those big load centres that you might have in other states. So but I can't tell you what the percentage off the top of my head, so I apologise.
But a government building you're not classifying as commercial, are you classifying that as residential?
No, that's commercial, but they're not large loads. You know, I lived in Gladstone in Queensland at one stage, and there's 2 smelters and there's loading, chip loading yards and those sorts of things. So we don't have those really big load areas that a lot of other places do. So I'm certainly not saying that something like Woden Shopping Centre, for example, isn't a big drawer of electricity.
Out of curiosity,
Yep.
what happens when a big load trips off the line? Say you lose a smelter for some sort of safety reason or something.
Yep.
It must take time for the generation to actually have to be brought down to...
Well, because it's part of that whole national grid, then it's actually relatively, it's a very large load. Usually something like a smelter is connected directly to the transmission line. They don't go through the distribution lines at all. They're connected straight in. Quite often they'll be a direct purchaser, so they'll actually have contracts with generators for the supply of electricity. So they kind of self look after themselves. But if that's lost, you really don't see that. You may see a slight bump on the network, that if you were concentrating in pickup,
I was just wondering from the generator's perspective, does your generation just go to earth until you can actually slow it down, or?
Yeah, you can quite easily trip generation off and just take it offline straight away, so it's not generating. It'll still be spinning, but it won't actually be generating out. Yeah. So the three levels of lack of reserve that this refers to the lines on the previous page, where when you get that red line, that's the lack of reserve 3, and that just means basically there's no reserve left at all. LRR2 is when there's only one of your largest generation plants still between you and zero reserve, and then LRR1 is when there's still 2 major units. Right? And that's on the basis that if you lost one of those units, what's the impact of it? So that's why they take it on the biggest. So that's basically what happened during that time. We never got to a point where we had to do any direct load shedding, and I don't believe that's the case anywhere else across Australia, but it was certainly kind of on a nice edge, I guess, during that time, and hence we stood up what we call emergency management team. So we had a team that was coordinating on our side, so that we always knew that we would be ready to take action, and then ran their emergency management process as well with those daily briefing sessions and so on, and their direct intervention.
How does this fit in with, I guess, the ACT government's plan to reduce gas usage in the ACT, and we're not putting the infrastructure around everywhere, and with Whitlam, Coombs and Wright, and Coombs number 2, which hasn't been developed yet, which is all that land, and obviously, is there more substations to be built out this way to accommodate that? Because once they start getting rid of gas, you need another source of energy, and we can't connect the stars and bring the star down. We're not going to build a nuclear power plant here in Canberra, obviously. So how does this fit in with the future of Canberra and the power supply when the ACT government is pushing everyone to go to electric heating and heat pump, all that sort of thing? So how does that fit in with the strategy and all that?
So if you're talking purely at an ACT level, if every home in the ACT was converted to converted off gas into electricity, then the market almost wouldn't see it, because the relative size of the whole market relative to 450,000 residents in the ACT. So at a market level, it would be kind of not even really noticed. But certainly our network, not so much those greenfields developments that you talked about, because basically if a developer says, whether it's driven through the ACT government or not, but if a developer says, I don't want to put gas in here, now which they're allowed to do that if they wish, and therefore I want you to put in the electrical infrastructure to have, on the basis that'll be the sole source of energy, then we just design it and build it accordingly. We then look at what does that impact have at the next point kind of back out, and see whether that makes a difference or not, and sometimes it may or may not, and then look and see what impact back. So we're then just looking at what do we need to do with our network to ensure that our network can carry the level of demand that's going to come through those fully electrified suburbs. So it's really at that level from an overall perspective. The market itself wouldn't notice it. Certainly if everywhere in Australia that's on gas now and is also on the national electricity market went away from gas, then that would be very significant, because there are very large gas users outside of the ACT in particular. But from our perspective, it's just part of our planning studies, which is business as usual. We just use different numbers for a fully electric line versus a line that's going to have gas feeding energy into that particular part of the ACT.
So with every household potentially picking up an electric vehicle in the future, or maybe two, you're talking potentially 30, 40 kilowatt draw, depending on the technology in the car and its functions and things like that. So and you're saying that is the structure there to have that capacity, because every night when someone comes home and plugs their vehicle in, they have charge the next day because they're playing soccer and running around and things like that. Is the grid going to cope with that sort of draw and so forth? We're talking 2 electric vehicles per household potentially in the next 3.
So we actually did a modelling exercise last year. We took on a company to help us build a dynamic model to actually model what the electricity network would look like if it ultimately ended up without any gas supply in the ACT. So we've actually built a model that gives us a sense of what that would look like over the next, and I guess we based that off of the 2045 target on the assumption that ACT would be fully decarbonised, whatever that ultimately means by 2045. So we looked at 2 scenarios. One scenario was that the network would be 100% electricity and there'd be no gas. And then the second scenario was that there would be a reduction in gas demand, so a few less customers, but it would convert to a green gas to achieve the net zero outcome. So we modelled both of those and looked at what that would look like. So we actually have a pretty fair idea on what we would need to do to the electricity network over the next 23 years to achieve both of those outcomes. And then the issue just becomes, what's the uptake? You know, does it go like this, or does it go like that, or how does it get there, and how much of that investment is today versus 5 years' time, 10 years, 15, 20 years, that sort of thing.
I guess with hydrogen being really ruled out, it's only European, it's not going to take off in Australia, it's going to be about lithium-ion batteries and how fast they can charge and the draw, and the faster the charge, the bigger the draw. Especially when it comes to DC output versus AC output.
Well, we certainly feel that hydrogen could well be an option, and
you burn 4 times the amount of energy to produce the hydrogen.
Yeah, but if you produce that energy to create the hydrogen, and you do it from a renewable sense, which I think is ultimately the only way to do it, then it can still be a green option. And there are certainly industries, and industries in particular, that are still very strongly saying that they need the heat that gas can generate versus what they can get out of electricity. So there's some things to solve. I guess I'm not trying to put a position forward. I'm just putting forward what we're doing. So all of the gas network owners across Australia are looking at it, because ultimately there are billions of dollars in gas networks sitting in the ground and running around the country as there is electricity assets. So if there is truly a green solution, then that network can continue to play a role in the future. But it has to be viable. People have to feel it's the right thing to do, and it has to be able to be produced accordingly. But there's a lot of trials happening from that perspective now across Australia, particularly Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, and to a lesser degree Victoria.
So did the future plan include a so-called battery like they did in South Australia? Are we factoring that into, because basically when the big fans are blowing, especially in winter time, we know that the wind doesn't stop at winter time, it keeps blowing through at night, so we'll still be generating to keep providing power and things like that. So is there forecast for some sort of battery with the ACT to...
Well, the ACT government have made commitments around batteries.
You guys, or is there provisions?
Yeah, the way we are regulated as a regulated business, we predominantly won't operate in the battery space because we're the truck driver, we're the truck that carries stuff around. So, but the energy storage through battery, through things like Snowy Hydro 2, that they will become critically important as we convert to more renewables over the next number of years, because you need the thing that you get with a big generation plant is you've got a big lump of metal that's rotating, and so it's got inertia, and when it gets loaded quickly, it's able to use its inertia to maintain voltage and frequency and those sorts of things. Whereas you either have it or you don't have it with a wind or solar. So batteries, it's just part of the equation. So yeah, you'll see a proliferation of batteries or some form of storage. Predominantly batteries that will be developed as more and more renewables can be developed.
So a grid forming inverter.
Pass. I'll have to take that question on notice. Well, I don't think I've ever heard that term.
Oh, they're out there. It's existing technology.
It's
not black started grid on.
Yeah. Well, certainly, you can use batteries as synthetic inertia. That's the comment I was just making there. You can use flywheels as another form of inertia. So I'm definitely not saying that there's any issues with this being created. I'm just saying they just progressively need to be built relative to the volume of renewable versus the volume of what is considered traditional generation supply.
As a grid operator, ACT, does it make it easier or less expensive in infrastructure terms if community batteries are rolled out so that you effectively have sponges that can just absorb the surplus generation and reduce the amount of current that's got to flow from the sunny parts to the cloudy bits?
Yeah, look, community batteries as well as behind the meter batteries will play a key role in the whole kind of ecosystem of how the network will operate, and we'll plan what we need to do as far as size of wires and size of transformers and those sorts of things based on the spread of batteries and the role that they're able to play.
Is there a minimum size for a community battery?
There is from a market perspective. I think anything over either 1 or 2 megawatts can play a role in the market. Anything under that doesn't. But otherwise,
that's peak power output as opposed to capacity.
Yeah, and but also frequency control as well. Yeah. So there's that's not a limitation. It's just something to be addressed as you go through the process. Yeah.
I was talking to an installer on the street the other day, as one does, and he was putting in an electric system in a ducted electric someone's place. And he said he would have been better off getting gas there. And he said something along the lines of what I think you just said, was that does gas heat hotter? Do you get more heat out of gas?
Yeah, look, certainly for some industries like asphalt, for example, asphalt, they need really intense heat, and you get that more efficiently out of gas than you do out of electricity. That's current. Doesn't mean to say that won't change in the future, but yeah, there are some industries where gas is better suited for those sorts of productions.
But is that per kilogram or something?
It's volume of energy and that ability to get that heat quickly and hold it.
They say gas is 1-to-1 ratio and electricity is 1-to-3 pump system.
I haven't heard that particular, but I'm certainly not disputing.
So the 1-to-1 ratio means it's a hotter burn, it's quicker, it's more instant with the gas, whereas the heat pump, because it works on the outside transition of heat and air and mass and all that, it's not as hot and quick. It's like a 1-to-3, and it's not as efficient?
So I certainly don't want to get into the debate about whether there should be or shouldn't be gas. That's kind of not what I see, but it's a pretty complex. Yeah, it's a pretty complex.
So you need a smaller duct to get the same amount of heat shifted into your room. So the infrastructure just costs less initially. With the gas duct system, I would have thought.
Yeah. So I might keep moving so I don't take up the whole night. So just talking about the bill and what makes up the bill in electricity and what's happened with prices most recently. The typical ACT residential bill has got a number of components in it. The orange is our component, and so our costs, when you pay your electricity bill, you pay that to a retailer, and then the retailer pays us that percentage of your bill so that we're able to operate our network. So you've never received a bill for us providing a network. We may have done some work for people in the room, and therefore we've charged for that. But for the operation of our network, it fully comes back through your electricity bill, and in the gas case through your gas bill. So it makes up currently around 32%, and that's also part of that's also the network that Derrin talked about earlier. Those big transmission lines that are traversing across the ACT and New South Wales that are operated by Transgrid. So that's 32%. There are things that are the jurisdictional charges, so there's some charges that we pay back to the ACT. It does also include usually an allowance in there for the large feed-in tariff, which you mentioned before. Then there's the cost of the wholesale energy, so buying from the market, regardless of what that happens to be, whether it's whether it's it comes from a solar source or whatever. The average cost of those wholesale purchases is around 38%, and then retail costs and their margins about 14%. So that's roughly how the bill's made up. I worked in regional Queensland for a number of years, and if you've ever been to Queensland and you've driven out to places like Quilpie and Cunnamulla and those, so they're connected to the grid. They're in that coloured bit down the bottom, and so they've got long distances and so a lot of line for a very small number of customers. So a company like Ergon Energy, for example, their size of the network bill is much larger. They play a bigger role because they've got a very large network and a small customer base, whereas we've got a relatively small customer base and a reasonably intense number of customers for the size of our network. So that plays a role in that.
Do you have the same number of slices in the pie chart when we used to have a vertically integrated approach to?
You still would have been able to put that. I mean, the reality was.
Well, we still have retail and other costs. I can see the other three we definitely have. All of those.
Yeah. So those that operate and have devised the market would suggest to you that this operation is the way to get the best price.
Because that's their jobs.
Yeah. So I'm not going to get into that debate. Another time. Thanks, Bill. So that just gives you a sense of how the bill's made up. What's happened in the 22-23 average annual electricity bill charge component is what we're seeing is the transmission part of that breakdown at 30% has gone up a bit, and that's associated with all the work that Transgrid have been doing more holistically in New South Wales. So we're seeing a flow through that. The reality is, whereas ACT residents need to pay our share of that, in effect. And the Australian Energy Regulator regulates that to ensure that we're only getting the portion that we should get. But so that's gone up by 6%. Ours has actually gone down by about 5% this year. So the amount of revenue we need to run our network for the next 12 months has gone down. That's about 5% lower. The jurisdictional charges or schemes, there's been a significant reduction there, and that's primarily driven through the large feed-in tariff scheme, where because wholesale prices have gone up, that means the contribution to that scheme is lower. So therefore, the collection that we do on behalf of government can be lower this year. And then metering charges are a set charge and are predominantly moved by CPI and anything else there. So again, it's a regulated charge, and that's what's happened there. So you've seen this movement, which is going to then ultimately result in our component, or the network charge of the component, having a 10% reduction this year. From a large feed-in scale tariff perspective, it was established by the ACT government to achieve 100% renewable energy target. Payments to contracted large-scale generators are administered by Evo Energy, so we don't own the contracts. We have never set the contracts. We purely administer the process. So if there's a payment to be made to the generator, we make that. If there's money to be brought back from the generator because their contract says is X amount of dollars for every megawatt hour. If the market's higher than that, then they pay back. If the market's lower, we pay them for that so that they get the guarantee of their contract. But that money is not our money. It's just purely administered by Evo Energy. So the next stop point is that contract for difference. They pay this way if they're getting more than their contracted price, the market's higher, and money goes the other way if they're getting less money. Any over recovery of revenue is returned to ACT government, ACT customers. So if we over recover 1 year because what we estimate the wholesale market is, and therefore the level of payment is higher than we think it is, then that actually gets returned in the bill the following year. And then any under recovery is the same thing. So you may, I'm not sure this is a wound I want to open, but I'll go there anyway. Last year, you may remember at this time of year, a little bit earlier, electricity charges actually went up quite a bit on the network charges. And that was primarily, certainly not 100%, but primarily driven by the jurisdictional charges and LFIP. This year we're seeing with that really high market that there's a saving to be had with it, and that's what's partially driving that return. Yeah, thanks, Bill. From a perspective, from a future perspective, it goes to a couple of questions that's been asked. We are very much developing that plan for what does the network need to look like for the future, so that ideally the network's there ready to be used when when that change happens. There was an article in, I think, today's paper that talked about the block of land in Turner that's just been sold, and SLA have built into the contract, or however that's happened, there'll be no gas into that, and that there'll also be car charging available. So that'll go into our planning so that we will build the infrastructure required to deal with that requirement. We're also looking at having the right technology to be able to do that so that we can operate the network. Those questions around community battery, if you can take those peaks and troughs out, then we build the network for the peak. And if you can reduce the peak, then we build less network. If we build less network, that means our charges are lower. So that's a good outcome to get, and that's what we try to do. So the more control, and we'll only ever have a certain amount of control, but the more control we have to maintain that peak at the lowest level by not having everybody turn on their car charger at exactly the same time. And when there's virtually 100% electric or fuel cell vehicles in the ACT, the lower you can keep that peak, the less network we'd ultimately build, and batteries and other those technologies will play a role there. And then having the right information, which is the piece I'm just talking about, the better data we have around what's people's behaviours, when do people want to charge, where are batteries, where aren't batteries, particularly the behind the meter. We'll know where the community batteries are, but behind the meter, We don't necessarily know where those are, but the better the data that we can get enables us to make better decisions so that we ultimately only put in place the investment that we really need to ensure that we keep the lights on and we don't overinvest. We actually are predicting that by 2045 that we'll have better utilisation out of our network, which will be driven by what we think will be the take-up rate of electric vehicles.
How does a community battery, what's the procedure for getting one built and installed? Can it be done by a group of individuals who are interested, or is it top-down?
No, it can be by a group of people that decide to invest together and look at what's the payback of that. So there's a term called aggregator out there, where aggregators are looking to bring together virtual power plants. You would have seen and probably know a bit about. And you can in effect have a community battery in that sort of scheme as well. So the current arrangements are that distribution businesses such as Evo Energy are not able to operate community batteries. We can operate them if they purely have a direct impact on the network and are only associated with the network, which will have an advantage to customers. But if there's kind of profit to be made out of it, then we're not allowed to be in that space. So because we're a regulated business, the level of revenue we get is set by the Australian Energy Regulator, and if we want to operate an unregulated business, that has to be at arm's length from the regulated business. So another nuance of the laws and regulations we work with.
There is some resourcing on our website for embedded generation, so embedded generation technical requirements and guides. So that's a good place to start.
So, that's rooftop solar, is
batteries as well, yeah. And so we consider it.
They only time shift.
Yeah, but they still store energy. So from our perspective, a battery that's taking that peak off can play a really important role in what we need to invest into the network.
Good question.
Hi, this is not a very technical question.
That's right.
But just in terms of you talking about your poles and wires and your cost of that sort of infrastructure, I'm just sort of wondering, there's obviously going to be quite a disparity now between underground networks and things in the newer suburbs and the older suburbs where we look out and we see a rat's nest of poles and bits of wire.
It's actually a thing of beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, clearly.
I'm working on it, loving it, but I'm just thinking that that's obviously quite an expensive network to maintain, and that is there any thinking into the future about how those older networks, older suburbs can actually have their overhead wires and things put underground?
In general terms, in broad application, undergrounding electricity infrastructure is around 3 times more expensive than overhead.
I think that's the answer.
And the backyard reticulation, or poles and wires in the backyard. So if we were to underground that, so please don't interpret I'm saying it can't happen, but there are reasons that make it more difficult for it to happen. But so if you've got a pole either in your backyard or on that corner, and there's normally 4 blocks, sometimes 5 or 6, but say at least 4 blocks. So that pole has a wire going from it to the 4 properties. People over your back fence and the ones over there, and then your neighbour on that side, just assuming it's on that side of your block. So if we then underground it, the first thing we're going to do is put it out in the street, because you're not going to be very happy about us actually digging trenches all the way through the back of your property, and it's particularly difficult to do because you've got fences and sheds and all the rest of the things there. So we put it out into the street, which means that those 4 services now have to move from the backyard to the street, and that's your cost. So that from your meter out to our installations at your cost. And then the neighbours over the back, so they've got it gone underground as well, so we need to put in that street so that they can do the same thing. So none of this is insurmountable. Everything can be achieved. There's no such thing as this is.
I did that with my house, and it was trivial. Just trenched out to the fence, and then they ran the line down the power.
Yeah, but that's keeping the line in the backyard. In that circumstance, is that what you're saying? That the pole,
So rather than running overhead from the power pole out on the street to my house, it just goes underneath the lawn, under the fence, up the power pole.
Yeah, as long as the line's already out on the street, whereas a lot of the backyard reticulations, that all the lines are actually in the backyards. So you can still go underground from the pole in your backyard to your property, to your dwelling. That's no problem. You can do that, but it doesn't take care of the pole and the wires that are in the backyard.
What about along, I'll give you a definite example, along High Marsh Drive?
Yep.
There's been a lot of work there recently to replace some poles to the bottom or something. What are the impediments to undergrounding those lines?
If they're already out in the street? It is predominantly cost is the biggest impediment. So the way we're regulated, the Australian Energy Regulator suggests that if you have to replace, and as opposed to something else driving, but if you have to replace your lines, then you'll only be funded like for like. So the funding we would get to replace it would be the same funding as if we were going to put it back overhead. Now, having said that, we absolutely have circumstances where there are other things at play that when you look into the economics of all those other issues, the easiest thing is actually go underground.
I think that's probably what I'm trying to get at.
That could definitely happen.
Every year when it's wet, it costs me $1,000 to $2,000 to have the arborists come in and prune the trees back. I'd rather pay you guys $20,000 and put it underground, and then I never have to worry about it.
And if everybody in your part of your suburb said the same thing, we could do something about it. It's usually then getting the neighbours to all agree that they're prepared to pay the $20,000 to make that happen.
Knocking the door. Okay.
Yeah. But look, I am not for a second saying that we won't do things, other things aren't achievable. All I'm describing is what needs to be dealt with to achieve it.
I was saying someone who's keen and seeing this sort of thing done, it's very frustrating because when I approach energy or anyone who is official, they go, oh, why would you want to do that? And now it's too expensive, it can't be done.
Yeah.
When in fact it can be done. They're making a judgment call on my behalf.
Exactly. Well, you tell them the next time you see them that you were talking to their boss and he said stop passing on opinions and answer the customer's question. I will hand over. I'm actually going to leave now because I've got some. I'll answer the question, but I've got some commitments at home I just need to get to. So apologies for not being able to stay.
Sorry, this may not be in the area, but when it comes to supplying to new homes and areas like single phase versus three phase houses, so a lot of the homes in Canberra are all three phase, especially where I grew up in Tuggeranong. And now recently I've helped a lady do a build and it was only all single phase. So, what's the cost? Is there a cost difference to actually putting in three phase to single phase houses? And I know that you're trying to reduce the draw off the grid if you have a single phase house compared to a three phase, but if you're putting all these heat pumps in that are 18 kilowatt, 20 kilowatt to actually provide heat to certain square footage of the house under the requirements.
Well, most times we've actually got the infrastructure all there already, so there actually isn't any additional cost on our side. If we had to upgrade the infrastructure because it's a much larger load or something like that, there could be a cost associated. But when we build, Whitlam and any other subdivision, there's three phase to every block, and so it's really your cost from our point of connection back to your home or business or whatever it might be.
So for the one extra wire,
you end up with three actors and a neutral.
Correct. Yeah, but it seems to be an extravagant cost to get it. especially on new builds and things like that, especially going forward where you're relying on an electricity network and we're still building a single phase?
If it's normally, assuming you're not asking for capacity beyond the design capacity of the assets, then it's just a connection, nothing additional. But if those assets have to be upgraded, which pretty much a lot of the knockdown rebuilds sort of fit into that category, because obviously not always, but quite often you go from a relatively small dwelling to perhaps more than one on a block, and therefore it's drawing a lot more than a single home would be, and that could require us to do some upgrading, which there could be a cost associated with that. Otherwise, there's some fairly standard costs.
Is it dictated by the builders that are selling the land and all that?
No, it really should be. Well, I won't say this has never happened. So, assuming you're not talking about rural blocks,
no,
where you've got to go 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 kilometres.
Talking right.
No. So, all those subdivisions and all those construction, we've got 3-phase running past every property. And so, if you want 3-phase to your home, that would be based on what's the most efficient way for you to operate your home relative to what you're going to have in your home. So it's really your call with the electrician about what you do. We don't really play a role in that, because we've already got 3-phase there for you. It's up to you to decide what your demand is and how you can best manage that demand as to what you connect.
So for an existing suburb, say for example for Nathan, pulling the suburb out, and you have only a single phase house, but they wanted to put 10 kilowatt solar on, for example, and your export limit is only 6 kilowatt per phase. Is it you've got to shut down the grid to actually run that extra wire? Is that no,
there'll be 3-phase there already.
Yeah, but to get the extra wire from the telegraph pole to the house to create the phase 3, are you having to shut down the grid to do that? Because
it'll depend on how safe it can be done. Our people do make some of those connections live, but it depends on their ability to get to it and safety. Quite often, some of the poles are at that stage of life that we prefer not to climb them anymore, so we might need to put scaffolding up to be able to get up there, and you can't work off the scaffolding with a light, so yes, you need to turn it on. So it's more a case by case.
I'm just going to say thank you very much, Peter. It's been great, but we've got 2 more very interesting speakers coming up. What do you say that we invite Peter back for round 2?
Sure.
Yeah. I was just going to ask. No. Please.
Maybe involved to check the design whether it goes over the river or not. I think it stops just before the market. I'll let Bill know. I was only out there a few weeks back, but I wasn't. I was in the Arboretum part of the line. I just can't think off the very top of my head whether it does or not.
We'll find out for a fantastic presentation, Peter. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Derrin. We were talking about electricity pricing and we end up with this. So I'm really happy. So please. Loved it.
Yeah, sure. I wouldn't mind a list of the smaller questions though, because there'll probably be some that will be outside my scope, and if I can bring information based on questions, then hopefully that could be more useful.
These ones were entirely unexpected.
All right.
Good.
This is your offline.
Everyone, I might just start by Jodie's doing the introduction on who we are and what we're doing. My name's Paul. Why I'm speaking first is we've just built a house in I've just built a house in a greenfield suburb of Stratton. So some of those questions you're asking about apply to that suburb. There is no gas to the suburb. And just very quickly, while we're getting set up, we'll show you some images of the house. We put a 6.6 kilowatt system on the roof, 5 kilowatt inverter. We've got a battery just under 12 kilowatt. All the suburbs in the area require photovoltaics based on the size of the block, so every block will have PV power. During the recent event, we're part of a mini-grid trial as well, so there's a trial in the houses around where I live, and during the grid event last week, we actually got paid for our battery to be topped up from the grid, and then later in the evening they took the power from the battery, and we got paid for that as well. So I had the most profitable day of having PV attached to my house when they had a grid event, so I love a grid event. Bring them on. It's very possible to clearly be using the batteries and the PV in that area to regulate what's happening on the wider grid, and just about a block from where we're living, a new community battery is about to be built. Bizarrely, even though we're a block away, we can't feed into it. It's on a different transformer, but it's going to be there in about 3 weeks' time. So we're very close to having community batteries in the ACT. I'm not 100% sure of the size, but the Strathnan developers have a sustainability manager working for them, and she's organised that community battery. So if you're interested in how you get one, she would be a good person to invite along to talk about community batteries. This is the house I built out of Strathnan. So for people who don't know, it's in West Belconnen, very similar to a lot of the new suburbs in the west and
Paul, can I introduce you first?
No, introduce Jodie.
So who's the first, Jodie? Look, to back up the earlier talk, we can talk more detail than I expected. We've invited Jodie Pipkorn and Paul Nagle along. Now Jodie's going to talk in general about retrofitting an older house, is that correct?
We're doing it jointly. So we're comparing a new and an older house. We're going to go through a lot of the energy efficiency principles, and we'll compare both. And then Paul will take over some bits in terms of the equipment and appliances and those types of things. And it's really just, I suppose, an information opportunity for everyone.
So Jodie is actually a sustainability architect, and Paul's an experienced energy rating assessor and sustainability consultant. They came highly regarded, recommended, and they're also pretty active in that Facebook group, what's it called?
My Efficient Electric Home.
Yeah, so if you're looking for something to pick up some tips, go there, go there and pick up ideas and look around turn switches off and so on. So anyway, over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Hello everyone. Like I mentioned, we're just going to go over today some of our experiences that we've had, both in experiences as an architect, but also as Paul will give his experiences as a sustainability assessor, but primarily we're going to talk about our personal experiences with Paul with his house that he mentioned, he's just built, and I'll go through, I've got an existing home in line, and I've done a lot of retrofitting on that, and so we're just going to go through some of those key principles. Because of the time, I'm not sure how much time we want, how long people want to be here. So I'll move through at a steady pace. If I'm going too fast, please just let me know. But a lot of what I want to share with you tonight is really just here's some ideas. We do tours of the the energy efficient demonstration home in Strathnan. We're starting those up again in August. So if you do want to come out and actually experience an energy efficient home, and a lot of the things you see tonight, you can actually come out and see it firsthand. And as part of those tours, we explain a whole lot of the concepts. I'll just touch on them lightly tonight, but you can actually come out and we can explain it in more detail. And that's what we've been doing for the last month, is sharing with people our experiences and just what you can consider doing in your home, whether it's new or existing. So, really what I want to cover tonight is this: how to achieve low energy homes that are more comfortable to live in and cheaper to run. And I think that the comfortable is a really important one, because I know if anyone is going through Canberra winters at the moment, it is quite painful. And we do have some we've been monitoring the temperatures in the home that we built out at Strathan, and some of the temperatures in there, on Monday it got to 28 degrees inside with no heating. So they're the sorts of things you can actually achieve in Canberra if you design a house really well and tap into that energy efficiency. To start off with, it's really about being aware of where our energy comes from, and as you can see from this slide, 61% of the ACT energy is used in the space conditioning. So whilst we use a lot in water heating and appliances, and there's quite a few appliances that make up that appliance group, it's really that space conditioning that's important. So what I'm going to cover tonight is around how you can make your thermal shell of your building more energy efficient, so it won't need as much heating and cooling. And then it's about what appliances you actually use to get the heating and cooling you need at those points when you do need it. To reduce our energy, and what I'm really going to focus on first is the home's thermal shell, and so it's how you actually make the most of that. It costs you a bit of money to improve that thermal shell, but it actually reduces the amount of energy you need overall. It's then about installing and using your energy efficient appliances, and then considering about powering with solar and batteries, which Paul mentioned he's done. And then the adjusting behaviour as needed. I'm not going to touch on that a lot tonight, because if you get the top two right, there's a whole lot of behavioural aspects that you won't need to do as much, because the other two operate themselves. So on the left on here is an inside picture of Paul's home out at Strathan, and on the right is my existing home in Lynham. And the key thing in improving your thermal shell is really looking at orientation, thermal mass and zoning. So these are principles. Some of these, if you've got an existing home, you may not be able to achieve, but some of them you can actually achieve. So on both of these houses, they actually both are oriented to get the northern sun, so it really is about focusing on that north sun, because it's the one direction that you can actually control how much sun you're getting in winter, and you'll get a lot in winter because it's lower in the sky, but in summer you can actually shade it out quite easily on the north. East and west is harder to do. Thermal mass on the floors, or you can get it on the walls if you've got internal brick walls, but it's really about getting that thermal mass to capture the heat from that sun. And then the other component is zoning, so making sure that you're able to zone off your house, so you're not having to heat and cool large areas, and that zoning can be done by doors. If you're in an existing home, you might not be able to put a door, and you can actually just put fabrics of different sorts, because that's enough to actually just keep the air in that space if you're trying to heat or cool a particular space. The second component is around the windows and shading. Again, you really want your windows facing north, but if you can get double glazing, that's a wonderful thing. If you're in an existing home, you might not be able to double glaze, so there's a range of films that you can actually put on your windows that perform like double glazing, and that's particularly good if a lot of them are very low cost. And on the website Facebook page that Bill mentioned, which is My Efficient Electric Home, they have some great examples of the sorts of things that people have done. The other component in the shading, in shading, it's really, and that's not what we need this time of year, but it's worth being mindful of, is that in summer it's really how do you keep the sun off those windows, and there's a range of ways you can do that. And if you do have your north orientation right, it's quite easy. You actually only need a relatively narrow eave to shade from the north. From the east and west, you'll always have the sun coming in low, so you've really got to get vertical shading, not horizontal. The next thing, and particularly easy if you've got a new home, is about insulation and sealing. So one of the things that Paul did really well in his house is insulated it and sealed it well. And if you do come out and visit the house, we've actually got demonstrations as to how that was insulated and sealed. And that's one of the things it's critical to make your home as energy efficient as possible. In a lot of existing homes, you can't do that as easily. So you might be able to get some roof insulation, wall insulation is a lot harder. But one of the things you can do is sealing, and I'll talk about that in just a minute on how you can seal an existing home. But in this one, it's also about insulating under your raised floors, which you may be able to do in existing homes as well. One of the things that Paul did take a lot of care on in his house was when you have penetrations. So when pipes are going through the house, or in this example it's showing a reverse cycle air conditioner piping, it's really about sealing around all of those penetrations. So if anyone is building a new home, it's worth being really mindful of this, because these are the areas that really do have a big impact on your thermal shell. And if you get those done right, you'll end up with a really good house, which will show you some of the results of what this actually achieved. In terms of improving the thermal shell of an existing home with insulation and sealing, like I mentioned, it is a lot harder. One of the things I did though is use this it's product placement, but it's full. I'm not selling the product myself, but Fuller's do this product called Ultra Clear. You can't get it from Bunnings, but you can get it from Mitre 10 and other places. And it's really easy to use. It goes on white, it dries clear, and basically I sealed up around underneath the cornices and the brick connection. I sealed under all of those. I sealed around windows and doors. And on the doors I also put door seals, and it made a huge difference in my house. Like where it used to be drafty, you actually experience the comfort now. So they're the sorts of things that you can do relatively easy as a DIY, and it can actually save you a lot of energy and make your home more comfortable. The other thing is for existing homes, and I did this with putting pelmets and heavy curtains. So one of the things I did with my pelmets, because I wanted it to look nice, I actually fixed a piece of timber across the ceiling. As you can see here, it cut into the corners, but it actually looks like it's just part of the ceiling. And then the curtains are fixed underneath that, onto the ceiling. And basically that, I used to, when I'd wake up in the middle of the night, or in the morning, you'd be breathing out your cold, your breath would be, you'd see it as white because it was so cold. Once I did the pelmets and curtains, basically that didn't happen anymore. So I physically felt completely different once I put that up. So it's something I'd highly recommend if you do nothing else, just put the pelmets and curtains in a cold room. And the next one is energy efficient appliances. Did you want to talk to
Just very quickly, new house, you asked about 3-phase power. I couldn't find anyone who could convince me that I really needed 3-phase power to charge an electric car in the future. I've got a 10 kilowatt system that's not a ducted system. It's called it's a multi-unit that can, one outside unit can feed into 5 indoor units. Pipes are smaller, heavily insulated, so it's not like the big ductwork where there's heavy losses up in your ceiling. I've only got 2 units running off it, but yeah, it's effectively a 10 kilowatt system. And again, feeding up you would have to use a lot of battery power in a car for me not to have enough power at the end of the day, even a winter's day, to be able to charge that car up at night from my own battery rather than off the grid. Having 2 or 3 cars.
Do you run solar on the roof?
Sorry?
Have you got solar on the roof?
Yeah, 6.6 kilowatts.
6.6,
yeah,
sorry, you can say that.
Yeah, with a battery just under 12 kilowatt. But yeah, happy to talk about if there's any questions, about heat pumps or other options in the house for hot water and other things around the house. But given that we're time constrained, I'll probably just hold off until there's some other questions perhaps at the end.
So one of the things, and this is like Paul mentioned, one of the things we have just done a bit of a comparison on some of these slides with other forms of heating, and one of these is the efficiency of indoor wood heaters, because I think a lot of people down this in and around this area do have a lot of wood heaters, and they're 91% efficiency. The multi-head reverse cycle air conditioner that Paul's installed is 472% efficient. So you put 1 unit of energy in and you get 400 units of heat out, so they're actually extremely efficient.
That's a nominal efficiency though, isn't it? As opposed to specific to this climate and temperature conditions? Because the CFP does depend on
whether that's based on the climate zone. Yeah, that is based on climate. So that's the CFP Canberra region.
Right.
You can put filters in the chimneys to stop the air pollution.
Sorry?
You can put filters in the chimneys to stop
air pollution. Yeah. And that's the thing, you can do all of those sorts of things, but I suppose what we're trying to demonstrate here is the efficiency that you can get from some of these other newer technologies as well. In terms of other appliances, and like I mentioned at the start, space heating does make up the majority of energy use in houses in Canberra, but we've also got the hot water and lighting have an impact and cooking. In terms of hot water, Paul used a Stubel Ultron heat pump, and like we said with Tony, happy to go into more detail, but this is, again, 3.94 units of energy it uses for every 1 unit you put in, so 394% efficiency. Again, it depends on the situations and things, but it gives you an indicator that it's still better than 1 for 1.
I just took the coil out of the icon and went it through the tank.
Well, just quickly on this tank, it's slightly smaller than everyone else in the suburbs. Got a 300 litre tank that does a 90 litre boost. That's nearly 400 litres of water. I didn't think I'd need 400 litres of water, so I got the larger ones at 302 units, around 3.5 rather than 3.9. So this one's 202 litres with a 90 litre boost. So I think 300 litres is a lot of, if you've got an efficient shower head, that's a lot of hot water.
Paul, is that on the heat pump? Is it on the same compressor, or is it on the main house?
Sorry, is it on
the heat pump? Is it on the same compressor, or is it on the house, the main one? Is there a separate compressor for the heat pump?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure I'm meant to keep using this mic. There's two types of heat pump hot water systems. One has a compressor. This one is a very common one. Particularly in the newer suburbs, the compressor unit sits on top of the tank.
Yep.
So the circular part on top of the tank is actually a compressor sitting there. Another popular brand is one called Sandon that, like an air conditioner, has a compressor sitting to one side of the tank, and they've got a bit more flexibility of where you locate them. You have to be careful not to locate this near a bedroom window because they have an anti-freeze function that can come on randomly in the middle of the night. And so you don't want to, they are like an air conditioner, they can be noisy, and so you don't want to put it right outside a bedroom window or your neighbour's bedroom window.
And again, I just threw in, just as a comparison, and this was the comment about gas, is, in terms of gas appliances, Host will get up to 92 to 98% efficiency, but they're always under 1 for 1. Whereas these heat pumps, the sort of technology they use is, 394%, given that it may be different in different climates, but they are very efficient as in comparison.
So what's the comparison to off-peak hot water compared to one of these? Because off-peak is obviously...
One for 1.
Right, okay.
1 for 1. One unit of energy going in, you get 1 unit out.
And then the other thing, I suppose just to draw people's attention to as well, is one thing is downlights. Whilst you can now put insulation over the top of a lot of downlights, you're still putting a hole in your ceiling. So in terms of the thermal performance of your house, and if you're trying to stop a lot of the air moving around, that is an area that still is a bit of a weak point. So one of the things that Paul did in his house out at Ginninderry was not put in any downlights, so it basically reduced all of those penetrations. So
that's true even with the downlights that have the canisters.
With the canisters sitting down below the ceiling, it's different because they...
I'm thinking about these ones you can say, they sit above the ceiling, but basically if you have a neat seal between the ceiling and the flange in your fixture, right, there's no scope for draft, but there can still be some conduction. Right. I haven't seen...
And there's no transformer attached to it up in the ceiling? Some of them have a transformer that derates the 110 down to whatever? No, okay.
So you're saying spring-loaded LED dome lights aren't ceiling where they've got spring-loaded clips on them. They sit flush with the ceiling and there is no effort.
The unit themselves are...
Yes.
The units themselves have got kind of wings around. The LED lights still get hot and still need to vent. And if you read the fine print on the globe, it'll say if you cover this with insulation, the warranty on this bulb is void. So yes, you can get a good seal around your ceiling, but if you've got 100 of them, not all of them are well sealed. And new houses have a lot of them. Oh, can I just the other thing that happens with them is that traditional electricians who've been putting them in for many years pull out half a bat when they place them in your ceiling. The bat gets torn in half and you're missing half a bat. So if you've got 20 in your lounge room, you're missing 10 ceiling bats. And you've got a lot, it's like a plug hole in your sink, you've got a lot of holes in your ceiling where the hot air's getting out or coming in sometimes.
So even like a 7-watt LED downlight, like from bright green, so that gets hot enough that you would have to just expect 7 watts to dissipate enough heat to be an issue, even if you put a bat over the top of it.
Well, you can legally put bats over the top these days if they've got a certain rating to them that you have to check. But again, if you read the fine print on most LED fittings in Australia, they will say once they're covered, once they're covered, the warranty doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah, not buying from the others.
So the next bit is we just want to go over some of the benefits, and so this is what I suppose this is on Paul's house, and this is the energy efficient demonstration home. What we've been doing is we've got monitors in different parts of the house to see what are the temperatures and how is it performing. So one of the things, this was just last Monday, so we thought let's just do a quick screen grab ready for tonight. So the outside temperature at the time we took this was 10.7, and then the inside temperature in the house was 28.3. So we actually had to open up some of the windows because it was getting too warm in that living space, and that was purely from the sun coming through the window. It was heating up the concrete slab, the thermal mass concrete slab, and so ultimately it was performing really well on that day. We've got some sort of more longitudinal ones, so if we look at the next one. So this is the temperatures in the main living space. We have got other rooms that I won't go into detail. So this is basically the 1st of June to the 18th of June, and this is basically every 15 minutes it's monitoring the temperatures. So if you're really interested, I can send you more of the detail, because I think that what's grabbed down below is not all of the times that we capture. Yeah. Well, basically 12.8, I think. So this is no heating in the house. This is just the temperature that the house has been maintaining through from the 1st of June to the 18th of June. Basically, the minimum temperature it got to on the 15th of June at 7:30 a.m. So the interesting thing we've found is the house is the coldest at 7:30 in the morning. A lot of the peak times, and we've got the time things, at 11 o'clock at night the house is still 19 degrees without heating. So ultimately the only time you need to really turn on a heater is first thing in the morning, because the house is gradually cooled down overnight, and then the sun kicks in again and then it goes back up again. So the minimum is 12.3 and the maximum in this time span was 25.1. It's now gone hotter. And then you can sort of see the minimum overnight, when it was the minimum that got to 12.3, it was actually minus 4.5. So the house only dropped down in the main living space down to 12.3. So it's maintaining its temperature really well. So you can be very comfortable in this house. And then the maximum temperature was 14, and it, because of the sun, got to 25 on that day. I'll just flag over these other temperatures. So this was during a week where there wasn't very much sun at all. So it was just that sort of first sort of week of June, around 3rd, 4th, 5th, and it was just overcast and not so good. So the house didn't perform as well. So it did get to 15.8 as a maximum on that day. And then if you click the next one, the maximum temperatures during the day were 10 and 9, so it still held its temperature really well during the day, and the minimum temperatures were minus 2 and 2.8, so it still, even without heating, it still didn't drop very far on those days when it was the coldest. So ultimately, to start wrapping up, an imperfect thermal shell and energy efficient appliances can save you money, because if you do need to run the appliances in this house, it doesn't need it for much. Because if you ran the heater for an hour, it would actually hold that heat and maintain it, so you wouldn't actually need to use it much. And addressing air leakage is a critical one, particularly for existing builds. It can reduce up to 25%. And then this is an example of the heat pump air conditioner, and this is from the sources My Efficient Electric Home. They've got some analysis if you want to know all the nuts and bolts behind this, but basically heating with an aircon, the dollars per 100 kilowatts, basically the heating with a heat pump or a reverse cycle air conditioner is half that of heating with gas. So ultimately here's the final slide. So if you want more information, we've just done a brief snapshot, happy to take questions, but basically from the 13th of August the energy efficient demonstration home with all those monitors will be up and running again. So if you do want to come out and visit it, we do tours. They're about 20 minutes long, and then you're free to look at the house, but we run through what we did, how we sealed the house, how we wrapped it, how we did all of that. We take people through the house and explain a lot of the principles I've just gone through. And then people get to ask questions and whatever else, but you get to find out about that. You can email us on that email address. The other plug I'll give is Sea Change does regular sustainable house tours, so if you are interested in having a look at other sustainable house tours, and a lot of that is people renovating existing homes, they do monthly regular tours. And then all of these websites are really good. The bottom one, the Green It Yourself, is a DIY website which explains how you can draft-proof your existing home and do all of those types of things. And then our website is thecommonSSS.com.au that you can check out all the information about the house, and we've got information about everything that's been done around the house and all the appliances, etc.
Question about draft-proofing. Do you have to, what extent do you have to worry about ventilation, forcing ventilation for indoor air quality purposes? The reason I ask is because this is a big deal in the States in the 70s, and in Colorado they did this, and it happened to be in an area where they had some sort of mineral deposit underneath the houses and had a lot of radon gas, and there was like an accumulation of some sort of contaminant. I'm just wondering, we don't have to worry about anything about that.
No house in Canberra needs to worry about that. The Australian standard is around 15 air changes an hour, and I would guess if you're living in old houses, in older suburbs, it's probably more like 20, 25, 30, so you never have to worry. We haven't done a blower door test. We have sealed this house quite well, and we think we'll probably fall in that 6 to 9 air changes. Once you go below 6 air changes an hour, you're meant to have forced air coming into the house.
So your house, you don't use force?
No. We haven't. We've just tried to wrap it like a standard house, but just do it better. So we haven't gone like that German standard for a passive house. We've just tried to do everything like standard Australian build, but just slightly better. So we've just sealed all the joints up. We've taken the top plate, we've attached it to the slab, and then we've just. But we will be doing a blower door test, and if people are interested in that, you go onto our website and put your name down, because we're going to invite the public in to have a look at how that happens and what it's like. But I would think we'll be somewhere in that 6 to 9 area.
It must be very uncommon. I visited a house some years ago in Chifley that had some sort of heat exchanger.
Yeah, which performed very badly in the bushfires. They clogged, the particulates clogged them up almost instantly. So everything's got a pro and a con.
I'd like to thank both of you very much. Jodie and Paul, who came to this fairly short notice, because nobody else wanted to talk to me. I like the way Jodie replied, yes, we'll do it.
Not sure we'll do it with Evo Energy as a joint distributor, but they do actually tie in really nicely, because we are actually like a practical demonstration of what a new all-electric home is, and a new electric home that's both energy efficient in a normal kind of way, not doing anything, having quite good windows, but doing everything else pretty standard. And also how that mini grid and all those sorts of things are actually going to frame the whole shape of what the new suburbs look like. Is there another question?
Yeah, so when you're talking about insulating, when you re-each house,
yep.
Did you put any start with the roof. Did you put any sarking on the roof underneath the roof when you did the roof, or did you touch the roof? Because you're trapping the air inside the roof as well, or did you allow airflow to go through?
Yeah, no, in the new house you're talking about? Under the metal deck roofing, so we've got a tin roof. We've got anti-con, which is just the foil blanket, they call it. It's R1.3, and all that does is actually change the dew point, so it actually keeps the tin a bit warmer, so you don't get condensation under it dropping onto your insulation up above the ceiling. And above the ceiling we've got R4.1, just a standard bat. We've used Rockwool, which is a recycled glass product. But we haven't wrapped the ceiling. It's a highly ventilated roof space, like all of your roofs. To do the extra step, we would have put the wrapping over the ceiling as well, but we kept it as a very standard build.
Right, and did you wrap the walls, or could you actually access? Did you Or these more on the outside of the wall?
We wrap the entire house like you would. The new wrapping that's required in the ACT is a breathable membrane, and we've used that all around the walls of the house where traditionally you would have had aluminium sarking.
Okay.
And again, the only difference we've done is we've taped it really well. We've taped it around the windows and around the top plate and around the slab. But it's made a huge difference.
Huge difference.
Thank you. I encourage everybody to get out and have a look at your house from the 13th of August. Thank you very much again. Thanks. We've got a meeting. I'll try to compact this. Right down. Now, firstly, there were two MLAs here. We had a potential MLA here, he obviously went. So I'm wanting to invite Ed Cox to come first to say a few short words. Now, for those who don't know, Ed's the new Julia. He was elected, is it called Canberra?
That's right.
Yeah, so Ed was selected last week. He will now be, I assume, in Julia's office.
Yes, that's right.
Ed will be the man. So, and you want to say a few words?
Yeah, given the time, I will keep it pretty short. But I did want to come out this evening and introduce myself. It's very important to me to get out to as many of these sort of meetings as I can. Because for those who don't know me, when I campaign, I get out there and knock on people's doors, and I try and meet as many people as I can, because we're there to represent you, and that's the approach that I intend to bring to the next 2 years until the next election, and as long as you're happy to have me there. It's been a pretty big and rapid about face for me. Up until just over a week ago, I was a federal public servant. Last Monday, they ran the count back and worked out that it would be me who was elected. On Wednesday, or by Wednesday, I had to have resigned, and they declared the result, and on Thursday I was in a new office. So I'm still finding my feet. Please be a little bit gentle, but not too gentle. I really do want to hear genuine feedback. My door is always open to meet with you, and I look forward to seeing you around the traps here, and I'm happy to take any questions at all.
Congratulations.
Thank you. This is the presentations that came before, so
Ed, you're not going to get off that light. I'll make an appointment to come and see you. I've got a list I want to talk about. Emma, do you want to say a few words?
Hi. Look, I thought I would just briefly let you know that some preliminary studies have been released this week into some investigations about development on Canberra's western edge. Now, this is really important because that western edge of Canberra includes areas bordering on Western Creek and Molonglo Valley. It's really important for our city to have a conversation about development on the western edge, because there are some really important environmental values in some of the land in that area, including places like Blewett's Block, amongst others. And if we're going to have a conversation about the future of our city, then talking about how we make sure that we maintain our bush capital status and look after this environment that we all love, and that's a big part of the reason why a lot of us love living in this area, is a really important conversation to have. You would have also seen that census data was released this week. You know, it really demonstrates to us that Canberra is a city with some of the biggest blocks and the smallest families on those blocks in the country, and so we do actually need to have a conversation about how we make sure that we can provide the infrastructure that is needed as we build new homes for our growing population, but at the same time take care of our environment. And are there areas of Canberra that actually the environmental values are so important that we should make sure that we protect those areas. So I would really encourage people to go and have a read of the reports, have a think about, what's really important to you about where you live, and please do get in touch with us and have some conversations with us about what those things are that are really important to you so that we can represent that for you in the Assembly.
Sorry, question. The environmental boards constantly being through. I just got on the meeting before coming here with the Conservation Council, the environmental well-being, and it is very important to stop breaching the environmental laws and to enforce it and to get rid of everything and that's including the right way. The long way to go is to just keep talking about that all the way down to the Cotter Dam, the rivers. They really need to be stopped because they are environmental, that's the environmental well-being, it's very, very important to, not just stop those productions. So anything that's important, thank you for raising that, it is important.
It is, thank you. Questions?
Bill and John.
Yes.
Talking about the Western Edge, it's 20 years on the 18th of January with the firestorm.
Yes.
So, is it 20 years too long for people to forget what happened?
I certainly haven't forgotten. I was living in Chifley the day that happened, and as I was driving back into Canberra, I'd been out in Bungendore that morning, and as I was driving back in to see what was happening to the city as I drove back in that day it was a shock to see what was happening to our city, and I don't think anyone has forgotten. In fact, as Mental Health Minister, I can tell you, I read a lot of research reports, and the levels of PTSD in young people in Canberra after that event, even people who weren't personally directly impacted, it affected the entire community. It was really quite striking. So yeah, those sort of issues are going to continue to be things that we need to be prepared for as a city as our climate changes. So it makes it all more important that we need to do something to try and mitigate climate change and protect our environment as much as possible, and also to find ways as a community to prepare for increasing and more intense natural disasters. There's going to be a hearing inquiry soon into the January supercell storm that happened earlier this year, and I'll be appearing at that inquiry to talk about the government responses to that. A lot of people have been talking about the impact of trees coming down and things like that, but there's actually a whole lot of other things that we need to be talking about as well. Apart from just the immediate physical impacts, it's also how do we come together as a community and make sure that we have the resilience for the community sector and government to work together to support people when they've got things like power outages, loss of access to a safe home to live in, or to being able to put food on the table.
Thanks, Emma. I was going to ask about the Western Edge, but you mentioned the supercell and people's reaction to that. I think their reaction, from what I observed in West Belconnen, where I go from time to time, would be that they would have been a lot happier if the government or whoever had cleared the streets and the fallen trees a whole lot faster than taking months and months to do it, which I thought was pretty appalling, to be honest, and really wasn't a good look. Anyway, going back to the Western Edge, I listened to Mr. Gentleman the other day. Despite listening for 20 minutes, I still did not understand what the Western Edge is and where these studies are. I mean, I know what I think the Western Edge is, but he would not say what it was, or where I could see a map of where you're apparently doing studies into the possibilities. So is that available anywhere?
Yeah, if you go to the ACT planning website, you should be able to read all about it on there. There's a whole lot of issues for us to consider. So it's, the environmental values are something that we think really needs to be raised in public conversation, because there are so many people for whom being in the bush capital is really important. Being able to protect biodiversity in our community means that we need to have some areas where we don't do development because those values are just so important. And being able to identify what those areas are and why it is that they're so important is really important for that conversation.
My interest is really what are the areas you're looking at?
Yeah.
For example, do they include the properties that were bought by the government 6 years ago down the Cotter Road towards the Cotter Dam, over the back of Cambar there, Milparu?
Yeah.
I wonder whether that's part of it, because I think people need a map to visualise.
Yeah. If you go to the planning website, you should be able to see it all there. Yeah.
Got another question up the back.
Yes.
Thank you, Emma. I really appreciate you bringing that up. I've started reading reports. There's 8 online. 2 that really concern me are the air quality report and also the fire hazard report. I thought both of them actually trivialised the issues, and I'm really worried about it. There is a map there, John. The Western Edge comes right up to Rivette and Chapman. It's really concerning. They said that it's a low fire risk because they can put mitigating things in place. My understanding is the area needs a rezone, even though the reports read like a done deal. So I'd love to chat with you about it. Maybe we could get some things going and have information for the Community Council and for the public meeting, because the reports raise big alarms for me.
Yeah, absolutely. If we'd like to have a future meeting where we can talk about this in a lot more depth, that I'd be very up for that. Yeah.
Yeah, we do. Are there any more questions? Well, there you go.
Thank you.
I think we'll be getting in touch with you about the meeting.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to quickly try to get through the meeting. The minutes, it was last meeting. Did everybody collect them? And somebody who was the last meeting, Rosemary, with the usual. Yes. Rosemary moves. Mark, do you want a second? Yes, Mark seconds. Sorry, brief version. Any business out of those minutes? I've put a chair's report out there. There were 20 of them. I think they must have gone. Western Edge, yes, that came up after this was penned. Otherwise, it would have been bouncing out of there. The other thing that absolutely annoyed us this last 3 months, is the draft planning bill. It was immature. I felt like it was the first draft that you did as a very junior public servant many years ago. So you went over it, you provided commentary on a very immature set of policies. And I thought the ACT government was actually getting us to do their work. Consultation has been like a session with crayons. Hope you're watching, people. We're appalled. We've been treated like idiots. The biggest issue in there is governance. Now, we talk about governance. What's governance? Well, governance is nothing until you get in trouble. Look at CIT. They didn't have the proper controls in place. Very clearly, I'm probably preempting a million reports, but basically, somebody went crazy with our money. I look at this bill, they could go crazy with our biggest asset, which is the land we live on, occupy and deal with, will and deal. Western Edge may well fall out of that. My reading of the bill, and then looking at Western Edge, creates lots of dangers in terms of very easy to approve, a massive development that the majority of the people don't want. So we've got to keep a real close eye on that. I've started looking at the material. As far as we're concerned, this particular part of the territory, Chapman and Rivette, just over the hill, there's 2 plots that look like they're ripe for development. I don't know if I agree or disagree. We will discuss it in the council committee. We'll come to you and talk to you about it, try to weigh up the arguments and come to a position. But doing that coupled with the bill as it stands is a very dangerous position to be in. I can think of a lot of government failures that have come off poor governance, and I can see this one heading down the same track. So please have a look at it. Give us your views. Now on the planning, we took into account every bit we got from public, every submission, every comment, and built into that submission. It ended up in about 16 pages we provided. It must have landed because nobody's talking to me. So we'll see where we go from there. Everything else, the only other thing I really think I need to mention, a lot of really good people on our committee, our friends at Featherston, were successful in getting a grant to actually have a garden party up in Featherston Gardens. We've claimed Sunday, 30th of October. We'll give you more detail about that as it develops. We want to have a happy day, bring in some music, plant some plants, have the kids running around. What else are we going to do, Rosemary?
Some food.
Oh, definitely.
Lots of food.
And I'm sure you'll be telling us what to order.
Oh, sorry.
Bring your own. Bring your own. But I think coupled with that, we really need to put the pressure on the government also about finally getting on and putting some public toilets up there. Now you might have heard the ABC today, anyone hear it? They were talking about lack of public toilets down in Tuggeranong. Well, I thought, if a penny for a pound, send text in, what about Featherston Gardens? It got mentioned a few times in the program, so between 12:30 and 1:30 today, you can go back, look it up on the web, they put their programs up. It's just a quick, and what about Featherston Gardens? So, the rest, I think I'll do a bit of read. So, are there any questions that are burning? John.
It's not a question, I was just going to make a quick comment. I didn't know that Western Creek had expanded its borders until I read the submission from the NCA about the LDK approval at, I suppose you'd call it, Yarralumla horse paddocks. For those of you who are familiar with where the old motel is, which is clearly in Yarralumla. No, I don't think it is Curtin. It's Yarralumla, because Curtin's on the other side of the road. Correct me if I'm wrong. So that's I would say that Yarralumla, near Yarralumla, the equestrian centre, and that's where LDK has been approved. Interestingly, by the NCA, I don't know why they have a finger in
I know everything about this still.
Sorry?
I know lots.
Oh, okay, good. Well, the second thing is it's being built on blocks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of Western Creek.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know that Western Creek was there, but anyway.
I looked it up when it came in and thought, get rid of it to Woden, get rid of it to Inner South, don't have to write a submission. And then looked at it again, went it's on national capital land in the district of Western Creek. Can that be? The district of Western Creek actually goes up as far as Scrivener Dam on that side of the river, and Lady Denman Drive to the corner. So I went, okay, got the lead on that. So that didn't stop the Inner South people putting some comments in, except they didn't recognise that Cod Road went past the turn-off. So we did a bit more of a fulsome commentary on that. Problems were, and I think we need to meet with Bocock and David Smith, etc. about this. The works approval, it's national capital land, so they do a works approval. It seems like the bar is a bit lower and they're more flexible in their interpretations. Now, 1.2 kilometres from the nearest bus stop for senior citizens. No crossing if you want to go for a walk over to Curtin, across an 80km/h road. That's but one of the issues. Putting a 5-storey building above a sensitive ribbon corridor, well, I hope they've got their filtration sorted. raised the issue about lights. Now, some people like that service station on the hill up there. I love those grounds. Initially, it was going to have those sort of lights. We mentioned there was an Australian standard for outdoor lighting. That's now been incorporated in the plans. But the other thing is, think about the view from the Arboretum. And I'm thinking, it's going to be a scar. And also, so the National Capital Authority says you have to be aware of the vistas, but it's only the vistas going up, not going back down. So keep that in mind, and then the further danger is all the other buildings that now will follow. What are they going to look like? So there's Brickworks development in Yarralumla, and there's all that land all the way down to where LDK is and the block next to it. They're ripe for development. What is going to happen there? So we need to have a conversation, and we need to go and talk to our federal parliamentarians about getting at least some good design and something we can handle. But then there's the issue of us being through traffic. We've got a nice 80-kilometre road. What's going to happen when that starts getting disrupted? Let's see where that goes. We can talk more about that one later. There's a lot more in it. Is there anything else anybody wants to raise?
Should there have been consultation, Bill?
Allegedly there was, Val.
Oh, but not here.
We got a letter and we had about, in the end, 7 days to turn around and reply.
That's the NCA's idea of consultation.
I wrote a letter on the 7th day, and I rang David Smith's office to get an extension to give me the 8th day. Because I just, just physically could not do it. I got all the views that people threw in. It's just these sort of things, when I'm saying like a meeting, you're a voluntary body, full volunteers, you've got lives, you might be involved in other organisations doing other things for people, and then this comes out of the ether with no flexibility and potentially long-term consequences. So that's my whinge for the night. One more. So can I declare the meeting open? I've closed it at 7:09. Okay, we're closed at 9:32. Thank you.